While Peter was still speaking, the Holy Spirit fell upon all who heard the word. Please be seated. So when I was a young child, probably 7, give or take, I had a favorite joke, and you've probably heard it before. It went something like this. Knock, knock. Who's there? Interrupting cow. Interrupt. Moo! Part of the fun with this joke was its variability. It was equally funny with an interrupting cat, or an interrupting sheep, or an interrupting rooster. So you could repeat the joke for as long as you had an adult's attention. And having inherited my father's interest in the history of the American Civil War, I was especially proud of this variant that I composed. Interrupting Calhoun. Interrupting Cal. There'll be war within the decade. Hey, that got a better laugh than I expected. But the real fun of the interrupting cow joke was not the specific content as much as the way that it allowed me to violate the social norms without getting in trouble. Because at home, I'd be corrected if I tried to talk while someone else was speaking. And at school, I'd be corrected if I didn't raise my hand and receive acknowledgement before opening my mouth. But whenever I told this joke, I not only got to interrupt someone else without correction, but I actually received positive attention in the form of laughter, whether or not it was sincere. And today's excerpt from the Acts of the Apostles begins with the Holy Spirit interrupting Peter. This appearance of the literally interrupting Holy Spirit is the culmination of a much longer passage in which God completely interrupts the norms that the new Christian community had developed. With hostility and persecution having effectively shut down their ability to publicly preach at the temple in Jerusalem, the early church has at this point turned its attention to other Jewish towns in Judea in an effort to continue spreading the good news of Christ among their fellow Jews, in the hope that all of the lost sheep of Israel would recognize Jesus as the Messiah. But meanwhile, unbeknownst to the disciples, God has sent a vision that interrupted the routine of Cornelius, a soldier of apparently Italian birth stationed in Caesarea, the Roman provincial capital. Cornelius was apparently what was known as a God-fearer, someone who was not Jewish by birth or formal conversion, but who nonetheless associated with the Jewish community and worshiped God. And the vision told Cornelius to send for Peter, who was presently staying in a town further south along the coast. And as Cornelius' messengers approached that town, God interrupted Peter's lunch preparations by putting him into a trance and sending him a vision. A sheet with all kinds of animals on it was lowered from heaven, and a voice told Peter to kill and eat. And when Peter objected that he would not eat unclean animals, the voice responded by saying that God had made them clean. And then when the messengers from Cornelius arrived, Peter and some of his fellow Jewish Christians went with them to Caesarea. And by the time he got to Cornelius' house, God had made clear to Peter that his dream referred to these Gentiles. which was rather surprising because the early Christians, following extant Jewish norms, considered Gentiles to be ritually unclean. And so even entering a Gentile house would make a Jew or a Christian temporarily unfit to worship God with the community. But God made Peter understand that he should not fear to socialize with these Gentiles because God had made them clean. And so Peter begins to preach to them with a variation on a sermon that he's given several times in Acts. And it's during this sermon that the Holy Spirit literally interrupts him. And just as a cow would interrupt with moo, the universally recognized sound of a cow, the Holy Spirit in this passage interrupts with sounds that Peter and his friends would readily recognize as sounds of the Spirit. Namely, the Gentile household begins speaking in tongues and praising God. And so the Spirit's violation of early Christian norms goes far beyond breaking the social courtesy of not interrupting someone while they're speaking. The idea that the Holy Spirit, God's gift to those who believe in Jesus, would enter these unclean Gentiles was mind-boggling. It went against everything that Peter understood about the church's mission. And furthermore, the norm in the church to that point had been that a person is baptized and only then receives the gift of the Holy Spirit. And so not only were these Gentiles exhibiting the presence of the Holy Spirit as loudly and clearly as the Jewish disciples had on Pentecost, but these Gentiles were unbaptized. And so the Spirit was dramatically interrupting the normal order of things. With this interruption, the Holy Spirit crosses and shatters the boundaries by which the early Christians had ordered their life and mission. The Spirit shows Peter that God is fully present and at work on both sides of the boundary between Jews and Gentiles. And the lack of baptism is no barrier to the love of God acting in the world. And so this entire episode with Peter and Cornelius serves to remind us that, as Peter said before his sermon was interrupted, God truly shows no partiality. Anytime that we say God's on our side, and therefore God isn't on their side, we're practically begging the Holy Spirit to interrupt us by speaking through them, whether they are pagan Gentiles, or women, or blacks, or Muslims, or LGBTQ, or immigrants, or poor, or prisoners, or I could go on. In this day and age, with all the boundaries between various us's and the corresponding thems, the Spirit could interrupt at any time with sounds that we would recognize as God's. Perhaps even using words like, the love of God is this, that we obey His commandments. And this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. 2 weeks from this morning, we will celebrate Pentecost, that great interruption by the Spirit that serves as the birthday of the church. But the work of the Spirit is not confined to just Pentecost. The Spirit's very nature is to unexpectedly interrupt us. In the words of the Reverend Lori Brock, the Holy Spirit is rarely convenient for us. She's a presence who disturbs us, shakes us, reminds us that the breath of God blows over us, changing us and daring us to live fully into Christ's love, which is not rational but lavish and unsettling and surprising. I'll admit that I'm slightly surprised to have gotten this far without being interrupted. But my hope is that all of us, as we leave this place, will be open to the interruptions of the Spirit, to the voice of God calling us to cross the boundaries that divide God's children one from another. That we will be willing, like Peter, to stop talking and listen to what the Spirit is doing. And then, in obedience to Jesus, to love one another. Knock, knock. Who's there? Interrupting Spirit. Interrupting Spirit?